afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Pam Scott. We are covering AR, Accounts Receivable Tips and Tricks today. My name is Jody Patterson. I am the Client Care Manager for Oasis Solutions and will be facilitating the webinar today. Pam Scott is our Director of Client Services. If you've tuned in before, you are well aware that she knows a lot about the back end of Sage 100 and does really good presentations on these tips and tricks webinars. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Just want to make sure that everyone knows that you will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but the reason I am here is to help field those questions. So as the questions come in, please put them into the Q&A or question window in the Zoom session. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And we will pause at different sections during the webinar to answer those questions as we go along. Do not despair if we don't get to your question or are unable to answer it live on air. As long as you've put it into the Q&A window, we will definitely follow up with you offline. We will also be sending out a recording of the webinar today to those who attended and those that were not able to make it today. So I think that's the end of the housekeeping. Pam, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Jody.
Great. Turning it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, for joining us today. And as Jody said, today we're going to talk about some accounts receivable tips and tricks. And today's presentation is we base these a lot on a lot of commonly asked questions that come into our tech support department, or when we're doing specific training for clients, we get a lot of questions about these various things. So hopefully today you will learn something new about the accounts receivable module. And as Jody said, please feel free to type in your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can, but we will respond to everyone, whether live or offline. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is in accounts receivable, I'm going to go into customer maintenance, and I'm just going to grab a customer, and I want to go to the additional tab, and we're looking at this area on the right side of the screen that says printing. And there are a couple of user-defined fields that are built into Sage. One is called a sort field, and the other is called customer type. Now you'll notice there's not a drop-down for either one of these. So if you're using these two fields, you want to be specific, you want to be consistent in what you call them. So these are two additional ways, these fields are two additional ways that you can sort the canned reports within Sage. Also, they would be sort fields that you could use if you're creating custom crystal reports. So this one is a little bit of a bad example where the sort says AMER, which kind of ties to the customer name, but this may be something more like, let's say that you don't use divisions in accounts receivable, but you do have a Louisville office and a Lexington office, and you wanted to track the territory of that customer. You could use that sort field. And also with customer type, you know, maybe you have some customers that are distributors versus manufacturers versus services, and you're wanting to track that and to be able to pull reports in that manner without using Custom Office to create those custom UDFs. So just wanted to point those two out, that is available to you. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about was the statement cycle. In Sage 100 Accounts Receivable, you can generate customer statements, and they can be generated, you know, on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, whatever you choose. If you notice, when you go back into your Sage, if you're not currently doing customer statements, the statement cycle is going to be blank. And I'll have clients call and say, you know, I'm going into statement printing and trying to print them, and it says there's nothing to print. It most likely is because you have not created a statement cycle. And again, if you notice, there's not a lookup here, so it doesn't really store that database anywhere. So you kind of have to be consistent with what you describe the cycle as. And it should be, let's see, yeah, it is just a one-character field. What I usually suggest to people to make it something easy to remember is to use a cycle of M if you generate monthly statements. Maybe you have certain customers that only get quarterly statements, so you could set that up as Q. Maybe there's some customers that you're having some collection issues with, or that they specifically requested a statement on a weekly basis, and you could make them a statement cycle of W. And then when you go to print statements, which we're going to look at in just a moment, you would tell it which cycle you wanted to print. And you can do more than one cycle. So let's say the first week of the month, you want to send everybody that's weekly and monthly, you would select those two cycles to print. And then the second week of the month, you would only select the weekly cycle. So hopefully that kind of makes sense on how that is handled. And then you also have a checkbox where it says print dunning message. And this is the message that is user defined that prints on your customer statement depending on the client's aging category. So, you know, let's say that you have a statement, if they're, 90 days past due, that it says, please contact us, or this is going to be turned over to collections. But maybe a particular customer is, your brother-in-law's company, and you don't want to put a message on his statement. You can literally uncheck this box, and even though American Business Futures will still get a statement, the done message will not print on the statement itself. So let me show you where that is set up. So I'm going to leave customer maintenance, and I'm going to go into period end, and I'm going to go into statement printing. So when I go into statement printing, I'm just going to grab a form, and it's going to say age invoices as of a certain date. And if you'll notice today, for the demo purposes in the 2020 company, they're actually set up for the fiscal year 2025, so you may see me using that date. You can say select statements with a minimum balance of. So maybe you only want to send statements to customers if they owe you over $100 or over $1,000. So you can actually put in that minimum balance, and it will only select those clients where their balances fit within that category. And here's where let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. This is where the statement cycle is. So if I was only wanting to do monthly statements, I could say equal to, and then just put in the value of M for monthly, and then it will generate those customers. If you have all of your customers set up to M, you literally could just leave this to say all, and it's going to pick anybody that has a statement cycle defined. And the dunning message, up at the top right, you see the message button. If I click on message, this is where it defines how you want to identify and what you want to print on the statement. And it's going to look at the oldest open invoice, and based on that, it's going to print that message. So if they have 10 invoices in the current category, but they have one invoice that's 120 days past due, it is going to print this bottom message. So you can change these messages to whatever you want them to say, and that is what will print on your statement form. But the message is, you only have one place to set up the messages. The message is not specific to a customer. It can't vary from there. It bases it literally on their aging. The standard message, you might have something in there that says, thank you for your business, or, you know, we currently have a Christmas and July sale, anything like that, and it will print on there for you. So I did want to go through and cover that. And again, if you try to print statements and they're not printing, the most likely reason is you have not either defined the statement cycle or you have not properly selected the statement cycle properly within this printing screen. So that covers statement printing that I wanted to talk about today. So Jody, if anybody has any questions about that, they can go ahead and type those in, and I'll move on to one other thing that I wanted to say about statements is that when you have two options with statement printing. You can physically print those statements and mail them to your customers, which does get costly and time consuming, but also keep in mind through paperless office, you have the ability to email those statements directly to your customers. So, you know, if you're printing 500 statements a month and mailing them, manually mailing them, you should strongly consider having that set up through paperless office so that via a click of the button, it's going to email those statements out. There is no need. I've had some clients tell me they email the statements, but they literally go into the print screen, print it to a PDF, and then they manually email it to the customer. That's still a lot of work and something that you know, is not necessary if you're utilizing paperless office. So that covers the section on customer statements. So Jody, are there any questions at this time?
I don't see any questions yet.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is one of the things that we were going to cover today is talking about debit memos and credit memos within accounts receivable. So, you know, a credit memo could be anything from you overcharged the customer to, you know, maybe they decided to cancel the order after you'd already invoiced them, something of that nature. So we're going to look at credit memos and we're going to look at debit memos. You know, maybe you undercharged them and you caught it and you call them and say, hey, you know, I didn't charge you enough. I need to revise that invoice and add to it. So with that, and please keep in mind for those of you that use the sales order module, what we're looking at today only relates to accounts receivable. So anything we're doing today is not going to be applicable to sales order, and it's not going to be integrated at all with inventory. So there are ways that you can do credit memos and debit memos within sales order, but today we're only looking at accounts receivable. So it would be either miscellaneous items or miscellaneous charges that we're dealing with that are invoiced. So you're going to issue a debit memo or credit memo, you're going to go into Invoice Data Entry, and you're going to assign it a batch. Let me see if I already have one out here. We'll go into this one. Actually, I have a sample there. Let me do another one. So when you go into Invoice Data Entry, if you were doing a debit memo or a credit memo, the proper way to do it is start the invoice number either with a DM for debit memo or CM for credit memo. So what you would do is you would type in CM, and then you're going to hit the pound sign so that it assigns an invoice number. And look at the screen right here, it's going to change a little bit. So when I type in CM first and then assign it a number, Sage automatically knows that this is a credit memo, and it automatically knows that it is going to be posting a negative number. And if you notice, this apply to invoice popped up. And this is where you apply this credit memo to your original invoice within Sage. I'm going to show you one that I already have set up in here. and walk you through this. So I issued a credit memo number, and I applied it to customer ABF, and I'm applying this credit to invoice 100054. You're going to put in the appropriate date and so forth. I'm going to make this no tax. I'm going to go to my lines tab, and this is where I'm going to put in either the item code, a miscellaneous charge code, whatever it is that you need to issue the credit for. I'm going to put in a quantity, and I'm going to put in an amount. The thing that you needed to notice here is I did not put this in as a negative. And the reason I did not put it in as a negative is because of the way I issued the credit memo number. Sage automatically assumes that this is going to be a negative. If I made this amount a negative amount, it literally is going to make it two negatives and turn it into a positive. So, I did want to show that to you. So I'm applying it to the original invoice. I'm making my adjustment for the credit memo on my lines tab, and it can be as many lines as I need to. And then obviously you're going to go to your totals tab, and then you're ready to just accept that credit memo. What will happen, I'm sorry, let me show you this. When I go to my totals tab, it isn't showing a negative amount here, but when you're looking, when I do my lookup, you'll notice that it does recognize it as a negative. So hopefully that's not confusing. And then at that point, you can go in and actually print this invoice or this credit memo just like you would any other invoice. And it will, instead of saying invoice, it's going to show credit memo at the top. And it's going to show that it is a negative. And then what happens is that once you update this, and let me just go through quickly. I don't need to print it. Let's just go back here. Sales journal, let's see if it'll let me do it without printing. And preview here. Okay, so here's my credit. You'll notice that it's a negative number. I'm going to exit out of here. Here's my recap. I had a couple of other, it just breaks it down with the debits and credits. And that's okay. And no. And I'm going to say yes to this. And then if I go in and I take a look at this customer, and Jody, you want to go ahead while I'm looking this up? I see that someone asked a question.
Yes, the question is, will it show which invoices the credit memo applies to on the abbreviated INV? I don't know if that's invoice or inventory. Let's assume it's invoice because we're not talking about sales order module.
That is a really good question. And I do not remember that off the top of my head. If they are willing to wait for a couple minutes, we'll do, let me grab another invoice here and I'll do another example.
To clarify, just curious how the customer would know where the credit memo applies.
Okay, right. I'm going to take a look and see if that, I don't remember off the top of my head if it prints on the invoice. And if it doesn't, it doesn't print on the credit memo. And if it doesn't, I'll show you how to make sure that they know that. I believe that it does, but let's just double check, okay? Let me just do this one in a new batch. we'll just leave this as is, sorry. Well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. Okay, it does not look like that automatically shows it. I believe that that field could be customized on an invoice, but let me show you a quick way you can do it without having to modify the form. I'm going to go back into invoice data entry and pull up that batch and pull up that credit memo. I'm going to go to my lines tab, and I'm just going to do a /C, which means to add a comment. No. Actually, I'll put it over here in this comment. Credit to invoice 10048. So you could list that there under the comment field, and then when you print it out, it will print that on the invoice. But I do believe that you can easily add that to the form to show what it was applied to. And that's a very good question, because you do want to make sure that your client understands and that it is, that they know where to take that credit, because on their side, they need to be doing an entry against their original invoice as well. So let me know if that clarifies the answer. And what I wanted to show you, looks like there's some more there, so give me just a second, Jody. What I wanted to show you guys is the first one that I updated. So this is where I did the credit memo, so you can see that transaction on that invoice. And if we look here, on the Invoices tab, you see my original invoice and the amount, and then you can see the credit memo that I did. That's the one that I updated, but you can see where it applied to that original invoice, and it has a new balance due. So you can see that actual audit trail, and that's why sometimes, in my opinion, it's better to do a debit or a credit memo to apply to that original invoice, so that you can have a full picture of everything that's happened to that invoice. And Jody, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions.
The questions from the audience were all regarding that one issue, but I have a question that I might add to that, continuing that thought. What do the credit memos, if you were to print a statement, would the statement show that a credit memo had been applied to a specific invoice?
Yes, if when you're doing your statement printing selection, you have the option to have it include credit memos. So it doesn't automatically do it, but you can tell it to include credit memos. I've had some people that choose not to show the credit memos on a statement, but yes, you can do that. So if there's no more questions about that, the other thing that I want to show you is, so there we were doing a credit memo. Let's say that you need to add something to a balance of an invoice. Maybe you forgot to add the installation fee or something like that to the original invoice. You can also add to an invoice by doing a debit memo. And the premise behind it is exactly the same, except with the invoice number, you start with DM and you click the pound sign. And there it shows apply to invoice. So it's exactly the same process. And because you've told it it's a debit memo, again, it knows that it's going to be adding to the invoice versus reducing the invoice. and you run through that exact same process. You know, some people will say, well, hey, I'm just going to do another invoice or, you know, do an adjustment, and that's fine. But if you want something to be able to send to the customer, you know, when you do an adjustment to an invoice, you can't print out that adjustment. So a lot of customers are like, you know, I want you to send me a credit, and that's why you would do the credit memo. And they want you to do, you know, to send them something physically that you're adding to that invoice, and you would send them a debit memo. So one thing I want to just point out, because everybody that has AR also has AP. In the AP webinars, we have talked about doing credit memos. In accounts payable, when you do a credit memo, you must enter it in as a negative. So it's totally the opposite of if you're doing a credit memo in AR and you type in CM first. So hopefully that was not too confusing, and it makes sense. But if anybody does have any additional questions about that, let me know. And I'll just let you chime in, Jody. The next thing that we're going to talk about, and it get this question a lot, is how do you write off a bad debt? You know, I have an invoice that I know the customer isn't going to pay, and, you know, instead of fighting them over the balance or whatever, I'm just going to write it off. It's not worth sending to collections, so I just want to get that off of my account. So what you really, you know, accounting-wise, you really don't want to just adjust that invoice off to a zero balance, because then you don't really have an audit trail of that client's history, what bad debts they have had. And also, if you're just, you know, adjusting the invoice off, you know, it's coming out of your sales and your AR, but it's not going to reflect that you literally recorded a bad debt. So I'm going to show you how Sage recommends that you write off a bad debt. And let me make sure, since I've been playing with one of these invoice numbers, that I didn't adjust off the invoice that I'm going to use as an example today. So we'll use 90. Okay. And Jody, I saw something else pop up. Do I need to address that before I move on?
I don't see any other questions.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. So when you're wanting to write off a bad debt, you start the process by going into cash receipt entry. Even though you're not technically receiving cash, this is the proper way to write off that bad debt. So you're going to go into cash receipt entry. You're going to give it a batch number, just like normal. You're going to give it a deposit number, and you know, make sure that the bank code is the one that you normally use. You can put in the deposit date, and your cash deposit amount is going to be $0. You're going to click accept. Then you're going to select the customer that has the bad debt. Where it says check number, I'm going to literally type in bad debt. You can type in write-off, something, you know, I would do something that's kind of consistent so that it's easy for you to identify when you're looking at the screen. I'm going to leave my amount received as 0. Then I'm going to go to my lines tab, and I'm going to select the invoice and or invoices that I am writing off. So in this instance, it was invoice number 90 that I'm going to write off. Now I have the option of writing off a portion of this balance, or I can write off the entire invoice. So maybe you have a dispute, the client has a dispute with your invoice, and you all agree that they'll pay for half of it. So then you could do a write-off for 50% of that, in the sample that we're going to do this afternoon, I'm going to make the assumption that I'm having to write off the entire invoice. So I pull up the invoice number, and you'll notice the amount posted says 0, and that's because I left my amount received at 0, so that's why it shows 0 is posted. I'm going to change that amount posted to $85. Then my next step is I'm going to go to line 2. Down at the bottom here, and it depends on how you have your grid set up, if you have items, you know, from this bottom drop down move to the right of your grid. But you're going to look on your grid and you're going to go to line type. And at line type, you're going to change it from invoice to GL account. And then on the GL account field, I'm going to go in and I'm going to look at my bad debt GL account. And I thought I had that set up, but maybe I didn't. So I'm just going to grab something here and pretend like it's my bad debt. And at this point, so you can see that it is going to credit my AR for $85, and it's going to debit my bad debt account for $85. So it nets out to 0. I'm going to click accept, and I'm going to go ahead and update this. So you can see there is my write-off on my cash receipts journal. I'm going to accept this. There's my recap of what it's going to debit and what it's going to credit on the general ledger. I'm going to go ahead and say update this. I'm not going to update the daily transaction register at the moment, but obviously that's a step that you want to do. But I want to take you back in and show you what the history now looks like on this particular client. So if I go to that invoice on the Invoices tab, I can see that the invoice was for $85. I can see a payment listed, but I also show that it was a bad debt. So that's kind of my indication that, you know, obviously it didn't hit my cash account and that I wrote off this invoice. So again, I like having this audit trail. Obviously, you can go in and adjust off that invoice completely. It's really up to you. But if you're doing it this way, and this is the recommended way through Sage 100, you're going to be able to look at history or pull a payment history on that client and look at those bad debts. So does anyone have any questions about how I entered the cash receipt for that bad debt? And
I don't see any questions.
Okay, thank you. And again, if I was writing off a partial balance, so let's say that I agreed to write off $40, it would show a payment of $40, and this would then still show a balance due of $45. And then when you get the payment in from the client, you're going to do a normal cash receipt for that $45, and then that would take that to 0. So get a lot of questions on how you do that, so hopefully that is helpful for you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about things that you can do to maybe facilitate tracking collections before you get to the point of writing off a bad debt. So in customer maintenance, on every customer, you're going to notice this icon that I'm kind of circling, and it looks like a little notepad, a little spiral notepad. This customer's notepad is in gray. I'm just going to scroll through to another customer. And you'll notice this one is not in yellow. I'm sorry, I said it was in gray. It is in yellow. It's highlighted. So if you look at a customer, if the memo pad is highlighted, that means that a memo exists on the customer. If it is not highlighted, it just means nothing has been set up yet. So a tip that I give to clients about tracking their collection activity is to use the memo feature to track your calls, when payments are promised, and setting up reminders so that you can easily take a look and see who you need to double check and see if they've made a payment. A lot of times I'll see clients printing an AR aging report. Maybe they then submit that to the accounting manager. The accounting manager highlights who they want you to call. You call these people, you're scribbling in little notes on the aging report, and then, you know, then the next week when you're looking at it, you're writing in more notes, and it kind of gets all jumbled up. So what I recommend to folks is to go into to a client and create a memo code specifically for collections. And I recommend it a couple of different ways that you could do it. The sample that I set up today is I gave it a memo code called collection, and then under the description, I just put the fiscal year that I'm working in. What we actually do at Oasis is under the memo code, instead of calling it collection, we title it the year. So our memo code would say 2018, and then the next year when we make collection calls, if it for that same client, we would have a memo code called 2019 and so forth. It can be whatever works for you. So when you're setting up that memo code, and let me set up one on another client just so that you can see what I'm doing. So to set this up, I'm going to click on the memo field. For memo code, I have a lookup. This is just going to show me what exists on this particular customer. It is customer by customer basis. So you want to have some consistency. If you decide to call it collection, then across the board for every customer, call it collection. If you don't, then you're not going to be able to run reports properly to review these memos. So again, I'm just going to use, collection as that, and I'll go ahead and give this one the year. And again, I'm working in a future date. So when you create this code, you can go in and type in notes about your collection calls. And what I suggest is something simple. And I want to set up a reminder date because I want to make sure that I track and around this date I can pull a report and see if Jody has made her payment. So I'm going to just start this reminder on the 25th, or on the 15th, and I'll run it through the end of the month. And so at this point, now remember how this is not yellow. I'm going to accept this memo. I'm going to exit out of here. So it highlighted the memo field. If I go in and do a lookup, I can now see that collection information. So let's say that Jody doesn't make her payment as promised and I have to call again. What I would do is pull up that collection memo. I like to see things with the most recent date at the top. So I might type in a note 8/20. Sorry for my typos. So I can keep adding to these notes as much as I want to. The other thing that you can do is you'll notice in the middle of the screen there is an attachment. You have the ability to attach one document per memo code. So maybe you send a collection letter, or maybe you get a letter from your client stating that they have filed bankruptcy. You know, you can attach that document within here so that you can go in and look up that information, but you can only attach one here. But if it's saved, you can browse out to wherever that attachment is located and then add it here. And I probably would add that attachment somewhere within maybe your Mass 90 folder, but it's certainly up to you. Just keep in mind that if you get a new server or you get a new workstation, if you're saving them to your laptop and you get a new laptop, you know, that path may not be the same and you may not be able to grab it for historical purposes. So kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So once I have, yes.
We have a couple of questions around that before you move on.
Okay.
The first one was asking how we set up a reminder, which you just showed, but I would like to expand on that. How does that reminder work? Does that create a pop-up for that period of time, or how does that operate?
Okay, that is the next thing that I'm going to talk about. So
okay.
It's in a different area, so that's what we're going to talk about. Is the other question related to that as well?
No, the other question is, can you update that attachment or change that, what attachment is on that memo throughout the course of the year?
I believe that you can, yes. Honestly, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. If you'll make a note of who asked that question, I will certainly do some testing after the session, but I can't imagine that you cannot.
Actually, I can answer that question. Yes, that attachment, it's simply pointing to a document, and you can update that at any time to point to whatever document you choose.
Okay, thank you, Jody. It just would only be pointing to one document. So, okay, great.
Correct.
Any other questions before I move on to how to pull those reports?
Nope, that was it.
Okay. All right. So once you have that information set up, in Accounts Receivable, under Reports, you have a report called Customer Memo Printing. And if I'm wanting to print my, quote, collection report, then what I would do is under Memo Printing, under Memo Code, I'm going to say is equal to collection. And then I'm going to pull this report based on the reminder date. And I'm just going to pull in a range because I may have, you know, maybe I just want to look at everything that has been promised in August. But you can narrow it down to obviously any of these parameters. But I'm just going to say, and hopefully I put in 2025 on that one. I'm going to say August 1st. Whoops, I had to type this in. And I'll do the same for the end date. And if you do this and nothing pops up, then you have made some type of, probably a typo in your date selection. Is typically, if you know that you have collection notes out there and nothing pops up, then it is, again, most likely that you've just made an error in your selection. So let's see if there's anything within the selection that I created. And you can, and you see here that it runs the report. It's running it in customer order. It's basing it on the everything that fell within my reminder date criteria. And then it lists all of the notes. So again, you might want to consider, instead of having it say collection, you might want it to be the actual year so that you're not printing notes that you've added, you know, 3 years ago, but it's totally up to you and whatever works. So this is how you're going to kind of pull the report to look as a reminder of who has promised you those payments. Now, Jody had asked if there is, you know, if it pops up on the reminder date. The short answer is no. You can have the note pop up where it says auto display. Oh, you can have it do it on the reminder date. However, it's only on that it's only on that date, and I don't really recommend doing that, because if August 8th happens to be on a Saturday, then unless you open this customer record on that date, it's not going to pop up. So if you want some type of a reminder, especially if you're like, you know, well, if this client calls and wants to buy something else, or, you know, even if we're going to do a sales order or something of that nature, you can have it to always pop up so that anytime I go into a customer record for this customer, it will pop up. So the reminder date is there. It just doesn't work great. It is very date specific, so I probably would not do that. So, but I did want to show you that, and that literally is the reason why when I go into this customer, this memo pops up every time, because this was related to an invoice, but it's set to always. If you have 10 of them for a customer set to always, you're literally going to click out of 10 different screens. It's going to bring up the first one, you're going to click OK, it's going to populate the second one, the third one, and so forth. And if you use a lot of memos, that gets to a lot of extra clicks that you may not want to do. So I'll just open it up before I move to the next section to see if anybody else has any questions about the collection information. Again, do what works for you. I'm just giving you some examples of what has worked for us and other customers.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, we just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to cover a couple of more things quickly. I want to talk about under the report section, you have an aged invoice report and you have a trial balance report. We typically get questions at the end of the year because the aging report doesn't match your general ledger. And the auditor is insisting that they need to know why and why those two numbers don't match. So keep in mind, and this is applicable to AP as well, the aged invoice report is based on the invoice date. The trial balance report is based on the posting date. So if you have an invoice that was dated 7/15, but you actually forgot to update it and you didn't post it till August the 1st, then it's not going to hit your GL and it's not going to hit the trial balance until August, even though it's still showing up on your aged invoice report. So if those two don't match, most of the time it is a date issue. The best way to test that to determine if it is a date issue is to run both of those reports with a 12/31/29/29 date, and they should match. If they still don't, then what you need to do is go into your accounts receivable GL account and start taking a look to see if maybe somebody did a journal entry to that account, and that could be why it's not reflected on the aged invoice report. So actually that's kind of a good point, because maybe at the end of the year you have a bunch of bad debts to write off. I've seen where people just go in and make a journal entry to their AR account. Well, obviously that's not really reflected on your aged invoice report. So if you haven't adjusted those invoices off, and then even when you do, it's going to hit your AR account. So doing it through the proper channels with writing off bad debts is the best way to do it. So then you're not scrambling trying to figure out why your GL doesn't match with your aging. So anyway, hopefully that makes some sense. And again, we tend to get those questions in December, January, February. So I wanted to cover that. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is within Accounts Receivable, you have a section called Utilities. And some of this allows you to remove customers or change their customer number, remove zero balance invoices. There's a lot of things in here that allow you to, quote, purge or remove. Number one, never go into any of these areas unless you have a good backup. because if you remove or purge, there is no way to unremove or unpurge. You would have to restore from backup. So you want to be careful in that area. You also want to make sure that not everybody in your company has access to this utilities area. You need to limit through the role maintenance who can get into these utilities. But I wanted to show you an example of something that may be beneficial to some of you, and that is the global customer field change. And this allows you to go in and make global changes to your customer master file. So the first screen is the main screen. And let me give you an example of where this may come in handy. Let's say that you have wanted to always print statements, but you've never set it up. And, you know, I told you that you have to have a cycle listed in there in order to print statements. And you have 5,000 customers and you do not have time to go in and set up all 5,000 customers with a statement cycle of M. You could say that you want to change all the statement cycles from blank and you want to change it to M, and then go to your select and do it for all customers. Once you go through and you click proceed, it's going to go in based on this criteria, look at every customer in your database, and if the statement cycle is blank, it is automatically going to change it to an M. So you don't have to manually do that. Another example of how this might be used, I'll scroll down just a little bit, is let's say that you have salespeople and a salesperson quits and you either give that person's territory to an existing salesperson or maybe you hire someone new. Instead of going in and manually changing all of those customers, you could do a change, you know, if the salesperson is equal to, let's say Jim has resigned and now Shelley is taking his territory. So I could say that any customer that has a salesperson of Jim is now going to be reassigned to Sally. So again, there's lots of different areas in here that where you can do a global change. If it is not listed on this screen, you cannot do a global change through this utility. If you had something else major that needed to be changed that wasn't on here, then you would need to give us a call and we would take a look and see if it could be done through doing an import through Visual Integrator. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to show you this. A lot of people don't really realize this is there. And again, though, before you do anything, please make sure you have a good backup. So I'll see if anyone has any questions about the global customer field change.
I don't see any questions at this time.
Okay, perfect. Well, a couple of things just to end the session. I wanted to remind everyone that on the morning of July 29th, we are having our annual Sage 100 user group meeting. It is applicable if you are using Sage 100, Sage 100C, or Sage 100 Cloud. It's all one and the same. I've been getting some questions about that. It is open to anyone and it is free. It is going to be virtual this year. So if you have not received an invitation with the registration information, please let me know. You can email me at pam@oasisky.com and I'll make sure that our marketing team sends you the invitation. I believe that you also can register online through our website. But again, as many people from your organization can attend as wants to. And again, there is no charge for this. So it will be our typical format for those of you that have attended in the past. We'll be talking about Sage, the current roadmap, you know, what's to come with Sage. We'll be talking about some of the new features in Sage. And then we also will be having virtual breakout sessions after the meeting, so where you can ask one-on-one questions.
Hi, Pam. I just dropped the link to the user group registration page on our website. I dropped that into the chat window. So anybody wants to check that out, you can go into the chat window right now and click on that link, and it'll take you straight to the registration.
Okay, perfect, perfect. If you're not sure you can attend, go ahead and register anyway, so that you get the link to the Zoom meeting. But we hope to see you there, and hopefully when we have our 2021 meeting, we'll be in person again. So if there are no more questions, I'll go ahead and conclude today's session. So thank you everyone for attending. Jody, thank you for facilitating, and we'll go ahead and stop the session now. So thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Pam.
Bye.